Hey, it's Radio Free 501c's first special edition, and I'm here with a very special guest, Scott Hodge, the author of the white paper causing all the turmoil, reining in America's $3.3 trillion tax-exempt economy. He's going to answer my questions and explain his thoughts behind this paper. It's February 6, 2025, and we start now. Hey, everybody. It's Thursday, February 6th. It's our first special edition episode of Radio Free 501c. I'm so glad you're here with us today with a also first-time guest for our first special edition, Scott Hodge. Scott's going to introduce himself in a moment, but what I would like to say is hello, welcome to our global audience. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is an important topic. I'm your host, Cecilia Sepp. We're here talking about a very important white paper that came out in the summer of 2024. It's called Reining in America's $3.3 trillion Tax-Exempt Economy. You might think that I don't support this paper. I do. There's a lot of good information in this paper, a lot of data, and I know a lot of people are using this paper to create fear in the nonprofit management profession. I think it's the wake-up call we've needed for the last 50 years. Scott disagrees with me on that. He says 100, but I'm not quite that old. But before we get into our conversation, Scott, welcome. I'm so excited to be here talking directly with the author of this paper to explain your thought processes and why you think this is so important. But before we dig into the paper, hello, welcome. Would you like to say hello to the audience and tell us a little about
hello
yourself?
to you, Cecilia. No, it's great to be on the program, and I appreciate the great work you do in the audience. And I hope that they approach this paper that I wrote as thoughtfully as you have. A little bit of background by myself about myself. I have been in the think tank world for my entire career. In fact, as you may know, I ran the Tax Foundation, which is a 501c3 organization, for 22 years. I stepped away 2 years ago as president emeritus to write a book called Taxocracy: What You Don't Know About Taxes and How They Rule Your Daily Life. And that got me started on this whole issue of investigating and exploring the history and growth of the nonprofit sector, having managed it for as long as I did. I'm currently a fellow in tax and fiscal issues at Arnold Ventures, which is a philanthropy. And they have endorsed my continued work on this issue because they think it's an important one. I guess this is somewhat of a man bites dog story. Someone who ran a nonprofit for 22 years, saying that we need to think hard about whether this kind of format, this sort of nonprofit tax-exempt format, works anymore in today's economy. I would argue that Congress has avoided this discussion for the better part of 120 years, and it's time to explore it and to make hard choices about the real difference between benevolent organizations, the women's shelter, the food banks, and AARP, the NCAA, Kaiser Permanente, Harvard, the Academy Awards, the Pro Golfers Association. Those are all nonprofits. Some are big businesses. Others are doing the Lord's work. We need to change the law to recognize the differences here, and that's what I've tried. That conversation is what I've tried to catalyze in my paper.
Well, and I think you do it very well. And I think one of the problems with the conversations about this particular white paper is, one, people not understanding all the time that white papers are not necessarily federal policy. They're insights and information that could inform policy. It doesn't mean it's going to become the law. I think that if you have not, in the audience, if you have not read this paper all the way through and really paid attention to what Scott's pointing out about our work and how we do it, take the time to do it. You can download the paper at the Tax Foundation website and get your own copy. There's no fee. I've got mine all marked up with notes. So I want to ask a couple questions of Scott to kind of dig in a little bit more, because I think this is our wake up call. We need to pay attention to what drives us, why we do this work, And are we actually modeling the behavior that we say we're representing, which is the core of ethics, which is another issue that we've been talking about a lot in our industry the last 7 to 10 years. So, Scott, when we were getting ready for this episode, you mentioned you're a tax purist. Could you explain to the audience what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think there are a couple principles of tax policy that I and the Tax Foundation have promoted our entire existence, and one of the core principles is tax neutrality,
Mm-hmm.
and that is the tax system should not be used to either promote certain types of behavior or penalize others. Similar types of income should be taxed the same way. And recognizing that the minute you exempt something from tax, you're going to see people start gravitating toward these tax exempt or tax minimized activities in order to take advantage of them. And we also believe in simplicity. A tax code should be simple. It should be transparent. We should know why we're being taxed and where our tax dollars are going. And it should be stable. There shouldn't be a lot of changes in the tax code. But to me, that principle of tax neutrality is critically important. And it's what's been lost when it comes to the tax exempt sector. And that we no longer have neutrality between similar types of business enterprises. Back to the issue of tax neutrality, and it's really critically important that a tax code treat everyone the same way and in an level playing field. And right now, it's not. We have large businesses that are tax exempt, and they're competing directly with similar types of for-profit businesses who do pay taxes, and that's unfair. It gives a distinct advantage to those who are nonprofit, and it disadvantages those who are trying to compete and pay taxes into the federal treasury at the same time. And that's just simply not right from a tax purist standpoint, but I think also from kind of a moral standpoint, it's just not fair.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I think it's not fair. I often point out in conversations and networking groups that there's too much abuse of the nonprofit status today.
Yes.
There's too many groups that I refer to as dining room table foundations, which are started by an individual or a family. Oh, my dog got run over by the bus. I'm going to start a foundation. Well, where is that money going?
Right.
And a lot of times it's not actually going to help educate people about how you can keep your dog from getting run over by a bus. And the example that really stuns me outside of Kaiser Permanente, which is just a huge nonprofit, is the example of credit unions. Could you
Yes.
talk a little bit about credit unions and how they are moving into the for-profit space?
Credit unions have been nonprofit since the 1930s, going on it's now been 90 years, but they are actually nonprofits well before they were formalized in law in 1934. It's grown to be a $2 trillion industry, and many of these nonprofit, I want to call them banks, we'll call them financial institutions, are now so successful that they're actually buying community banks. And they're doing so with tax-free profits. So they're making lots of money tax-free, and then they're going out and buying these tax-paying for-profit institutions, often with cash. And I kind of liken it to imagine your local YMCA buying the local Gold's Gym. Would
Gosh.
anybody think that that makes sense at all? And especially from a financial or a fiscal standpoint, here we have tax-paying organizations being turned into nonprofits. Well, that's bad for the federal treasury because you and I are going to have to make up that loss in revenues. We see similar things with nonprofit hospitals, where many nonprofit hospitals are stepping in and purchasing for-profit hospitals or for-profit clinics and so forth, turning them into nonprofits. And it's not only bad for the federal treasury, it's bad for local communities because many hospitals don't pay property taxes. And so now these institutions, a for-profit hospital that did pay property taxes is now nonprofit. And so the community is losing out on these property taxes. So there's a lot of inequities in these sorts of activities that are going on. And the issue here that it's growing in prevalence. And if we look at the roughly $3.3 trillion worth of nonprofit income every year, about 70% of that is business type income, especially as we talk about the hospitals and the credit unions and so forth. And a very small percentage of nonprofit income, about 12%, is actually charitable donations. So much of our nonprofit world is actually fueled by business-like income and not charitable donations. Should we actually call an organization nonprofit if 90% of its income comes from business-related sources? I don't think so. I don't think most of us, when we think about a charitable organization, we are thinking of the women's shelter. We're thinking of the food bank or the local community center. We're not thinking of Kaiser Permanente. We're not thinking of the PGA Tour. We're not thinking of the Academy Awards, which is also a nonprofit.
That's right.
And the NCAA, which gets $1 billion in TV revenues and pays no tax. Meanwhile, the players that are on the court playing basketball now have to pay tax on their NIL, name, image, and likeness, but the NCAA doesn't have to pay tax on that. You can't defend that.
No, I agree. You cannot defend it. I think while I am a huge proponent of nonprofits and nonprofit management as a profession, I have for many years seen these inconsistencies and seen the inconsistency in not only our messaging, but in what is going on as some of these organizations with the huge amounts of money coming in that have really nothing to do with charity or necessarily making a profession better. I do believe in the 501c status because it is a business entity. And that is one of the things the public really doesn't understand. You know, people say nonprofit and they immediately think charity, but it's not the case. You know, there's charities, there's foundations, there's professional societies, there's trade associations, there's soccer clubs, there's military veteran organizations, which is a 501c19. I actually met somebody who ran one of those. There's a lot of different ways that the 501c status can help make society a better place. I think if a profession is making the professionals in that profession better at what they do, hey, you're making the world a little bit better place. If a trade association is helping an industry perform more safely and create better products, hey, you're making the world a better place. Now, does that mean that they should be functioning like a for-profit corporation and not paying for some of these taxes? And yes, audience, go ahead, send the angry postcards, because I know I'm going to make a lot of people angry for agreeing with Scott on a lot of these points. But we have lost our way in the nonprofit community. And Scott, I know in your paper, you were looking at it from this cliff we're about to go off of with our national debt. And, you know, let's look for some places. It's not because TCJA is going to expire later this year. It's because we have this looming national debt that is building every year that Congress keeps kicking down the road. Somebody's going to have to pay the bill. And the abuse of this status needs to stop. And the people in our profession need to be the people to speak out about it and stop it. Because one of the examples you used in your paper was an invitation only golf club that you can't, nobody can join it unless they're asked to join. It's very exclusive. Whereas, like, to me, our nonprofit community should be inclusive. It's not, but that's another episode for another day. I think we need to go after some of these organizations that say they're nonprofits and they're really not. OpenAI, that created ChatGPT, claimed to have a nonprofit. They don't have it.
And they can't coexist either. And that's one of the problems with that is tempting to coexist this nonprofit, you know, we're going to do good for the world sort of philosophy with being on the for-profit side. You can't do both. And I would argue that certainly in the case of AI, that you can't do it in a nonprofit way. You can't get billions of dollars worth of venture capital and then claim that you're a nonprofit. I just don't think that's a whole different thing than a food bank getting donations from the local Safeway. And I think we have to distinguish between these. I subscribe to the donative theory of nonprofits, that we should define a charity as one that primarily gets its revenues, through charitable gifts. And okay, if they want to have a bingo, game on the weekends, that might be okay. But if you get 70 or 80% or more of your income in charitable gifts, I think you're probably a pretty good charity or nonprofit. But if you get the majority of your income through profit-making enterprises, like hospitals do, like credit unions, like the NCAA, you're a business. I'm sorry. And I think we need to distinguish between this. And here's the problem, going back, and I outlined this in my paper because I went back and read some of the original debates on the Senate floor in 1909 when they were creating the corporate income tax and trying to decide what activities should be exempt from the corporate income tax and what should be taxed. And they were having this same argument 120 years ago. And many of the senators then were warning about the slippery slope. How, well, you could be a mutual aid society and you could be a housing, conglomerate, but in reality, you're a commercial bank. And so they were worried then that people would come up with all kinds of excuses to claim to be charitable when in fact they were business oriented. And that's why, in 1951, the mutual savings and loans were their nonprofit status was taken away because it was there in the legislation. They were competing directly with for-profit banks. We're at the same point with credit unions today. I would say that the nonprofit hospitals ought to compete directly, or they do compete directly with for-profit hospitals, but they ought to do so on a level playing field. So either we remove the taxes from for-profit hospitals or we tax but you can't have half and half.
Right. You can't have it both ways, as my mother used to say.
Yeah, I mean, but you can't have a free enterprise system in which half the industry is nonprofit, collecting tax-exempt profits, and the other half that is for profit. It can't coexist. And I think that we need to make big changes in UBIT and the federal law and try to distinguish between truly charitable organizations and those that are essentially big businesses that ought to be taxed like big businesses. And especially when you have the kind of deficits and debt that we have today, we need to broaden the corporate tax base to level the playing field so that everyone's on the same level.
That's right. And that is an excellent segue to my next question. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about UBIT, the unrelated business income tax, for those of you who aren't familiar. So can you talk a little bit about your position in the paper?
Yeah, well, we explain the history of UBIT. Of course, was brought to bear in 1950 when New York University had acquired a pasta making company. Now, a lot of nonprofits at that time had various commercial enterprises, and at that time, it was okay. It was considered the destination of income principle allowed for, as long as, no matter where it came from, as long as it was going to charitable purposes, then it was considered to be a charity. Well, I think when New York University got this pasta making company, everyone said, well, that's a little bridge too far. So that brought up a debate to create UBIT, the unrelated business income tax. And it was kind of interesting. There's a quote from John Dingell Sr. During the debate over UBIT, and he was commenting, perhaps cynically, that if we let this go on, then every pasta made in America will be made by universities. And I think that kind of is where we are today with credit unions for certainly.
Yeah.
But the point here's where they went wrong. They were trying to define between what is related and what is unrelated. And the relatedness test is so subjective that it is unenforceable. And it has allowed the NCAA to get television revenues and not pay tax. It has allowed AARP to get $1 billion in royalty income. It has allowed for Corporation for Public Broadcasting to get all of its revenue. It has allowed these businesses to thrive, saying, well, it's just related to our mission.
Mm-hmm.
We need to get away from that test. That is the problem. The problem is not that UBIT is broken. It is. The problem is that we have this relatedness test, which is so abstract and so archaic that it can't be enforced. So let's get away from that and move towards some other sort of threshold. And I think the solution there is to define what is charitable donations, charitable income, and then tax everything else as business related, as what it is.
Right. And, you know, that's a really good point. It's very difficult to identify UBIT activity, even if you work at the organization that's
Sure.
organized as a nonprofit. It's really difficult test. I was a chief staff executive for a while at a nursing home administrators group, and we had to do a 990T because they were a membership organization, but they formed as a C3. So anything we did for credentialing or education was liable for tax because it wasn't for the public good. And so that is a test right there. I really was getting excited reading your paper again, thinking about all the things I've said over the years. I didn't have this kind of data at my fingertips like I do now. But looking at some of these rules too, a colleague of mine pointed out that there is nobody enforcing the nonprofit laws, really. The IRS oversees it and that they collect our reports, but we're not always paying money. We're usually just reporting our money and who we paid what on the 990 form. But there's nobody actually enforcing the rules. There's nobody really making sure you're a nonprofit. They years ago adopted the option of filing a postcard.
Yeah.
I think that's wrong. I'm with you. If we're going to have a fair system for nonprofit activity of any kind, everybody needs to follow the same rules. They need to file the same forms, and they need to be able to demonstrate that what they're doing is helping either their profession, their industry, or society at large. We're not seeing that. We're seeing so many things that are focusing, like a group that I belong to, focuses too much on the corporate ladder instead of why are we here in the first place. I got into nonprofit management because I think it's important. And I started at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce because I thought business is good. I think business is important. I support the free market. And some people would probably, smack me for saying this, but I believe in the invisible hand of the marketplace that Adam Smith wrote about because we can vote with our dollars. I see so much in your paper that is distressing to me for the future of nonprofits and for the future of our country, because you're really focusing on the fact that our country is so in debt that we could have a complete economic collapse at some point. I've seen a recent news story in which a business person said, our country's about to have an economic heart attack if we don't get spending under control. And now we have the second Trump administration has come in and is so active, people can't keep up with a lot of the stuff they're doing. It's pretty interesting to watch and follow, but they're trying to do that. They're trying to look at the budget. They're trying to say, do we really need to be spending this money here? Should this money be spent elsewhere? Or maybe we do let the states handle it instead of the federal government. So there's a lot of that churning right now, but I have to come back to what you point out in your paper is too many groups, like large trade associations that say they're nonprofits, have hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And are now more examples of what I say to people. I've been saying this for about 15 years now. People will not change a system from which they benefit,
Oh, right, right.
even
Yeah,
if it's right, even if it's ethical, even if it's what's better for everybody else. And there's too many organizations benefiting from the current system.
that's why we have $2 trillion deficits every year.
Mhm.
But everybody talks about the tax gap, and that's the monies that the IRS should be collecting, but isn't because of avoidance and whatnot.
Mhm.
Well, the nonprofit world is a massive tax gap that's been allowed to grow because of congressional inaction. So I estimate that if we were to tax the business related income of nonprofits, that at the corporate tax rate of 21%, we could raise about $40 billion a year in extra revenues, essentially broadening the corporate tax base to include these now tax-free businesses, and create more parity within the business-related system, but also go a great way toward helping toward lowering the deficit or offsetting some of the other more harmful taxes that are in the code, such as the personal income tax or something. But
Mhm.
here's an opportunity to, in a responsible, economically responsible way, broaden the tax base to bring in this now untaxed business income, create parity within the business system, but also help the deficit and the fiscal system of the United States. And I think that that's worth exploring. And Congress needs to take a very serious look at this. And unfortunately, there's a lot of trepidation in many members of Congress because, gee, I have a credit union in my district, or I have this, type of business in my district. So they're gonna have to stand up against some of these special interests and stand on principle.
Mhm. Exactly, because if a member of Congress has a credit union in their district, they probably have a bank too.
Right. Exactly. And one that's been purchased by
By,
a, by a credit
by
union.
the credit union.
Yeah.
Well, I got to ask you another question, Scott. In the nonprofit world, specifically with professional societies, we have dues income, we have conference registration income, webinar income, maybe
Yep.
we sell some books, things like that. Would you be open to supporting that conference registration not be taxed, but maybe dues income would be taxed?
No, I think it's all business related. Look, we have for-profit membership organizations. They're called Costco,
Mhm.
Sam's Club,
Yes.
Amazon Prime, and so forth. And they're all paying tax on the dues or membership fees that you and I pay to
Mhm.
be part of that and to get the special privileges that comes with buying 10-pound bags of pine nuts. So I think the same thing would go with being membership of some of these high flyers on K Street here in Washington, D.C., in which the membership dues are tens of thousands, if not millions of dollars. It's like, how how can that be justified as being nonprofit? Come on, especially when the CEOs of these organizations are making $1 million a year. Here's what really you spoke about your experience. Many years ago, my son was on his high school crew team, which was a parent-run nonprofit because it wasn't a sanctioned sport. We rented out our crew boats in the morning to an adult team. We ended up having to pay UBIT on $4,000 worth of income from renting out those boats. Meanwhile, the NCAA makes $1 billion a year on TV and endorsement income and pays no UBIT. How can that be justified? So here's this is the insanity or the wrongness of this system. And we've got to bring some serious thought to making sense of it. And the way to do that is to separate those organizations that are truly benevolent, that survive on our tax deductible gifts, with
Mhm.
those businesses or those organizations that survive on business income, whether it's membership dues, conference fees, or royalty income from selling your name, image, and likeness. And that's the way to bring parity to the system and level the playing field.
Well, would you be open to a lower rate for 501c? So instead of the 21% corporate rate, maybe 19?
The minute you start creating disparities between rate structures, you get people taking advantage of it. And
Okay,
again, you're back in the same game that we have today.
that's right.
It,
No,
it, it happens. Look, it happens all the time in tariffs, for instance, that one of the tennis shoe companies puts felt on the bottom of their tennis shoes when they import them, because then they qualify as bedroom slippers and pay a lower tariff rate than actually. So this is how the game gets played. So once you create
oh my gosh.
exemptions or lower rates, people take advantage of it.
Yeah, well, so then maybe what we need to do is look at a lower rate for everybody. I know I'd rather have more money in my pocket.
Hallelujah.
Yeah. Oh, wow. It's like instead of a 21% rate, maybe we have like a, 19% rate for everybody. I think that if nonprofits want to model the behavior of serving society and really being part of it in really contributing, I do think we've gotten to that point. There's too many. I mean, the pasta story just made me laugh when I read it again in the paper. We use that sometimes in our education courses. Well, this was a big landmark case about pasta. What does pasta have to do with New York University? Nothing. What does selling t-shirts have to do with the mission of a professional society? They do that as well. I've seen some associations, they're selling all kinds of stuff, baby shirts, stuffed animals. It's like, what does this have to do with what
Well,
you're
again,
doing?
again, it gets to the arbitrariness of the relatedness test. And so, if you're running a museum and you put the picture of a Monet on a coffee cup, that's related to your mission, so you don't pay tax on that sale. But if you have a coffee cup that says "I love New York," then you do pay tax on that because that's unrelated to your mission of promoting the arts.
Right. There
So
you go.
that's crazy. And so imagine doing inventory or accounting for that. So we need to get away from that and get away from this arbitrary test and get to something that everybody can agree on that makes sense. And that is it a charitable activity from charitable deductions, or is it business related and otherwise and should be taxed?
Well, and then I think we need another test, not just the charitable one, because again, not everybody's a charity. So charities feed the hungry, help the homeless, bring education to people who want knowledge. I do again think there is a place for the professional society. Now, does that mean that we should have that fully tax deductible thing? Of course not. And I think that's where some of the abuse comes in,
Yeah.
because I point out to people membership associations that are formed as C3s are misusing the code, because it's not what the C3 is meant for. The C3 is not meant for that. And I think sometimes some of these older membership associations use the C3 thinking there won't be taxes on the membership dues, but it's not true. They're still their tax deductible as a business expense, even
Yeah.
if your membership group's a C3. So what you have within our own profession is a misunderstanding of the code, how we should be incorporated, how we should be using foundations if we have a foundation that is related to our association, which I think a lot of associations have foundations that are not necessarily doing anything really different.
Yeah. It gives them a fig leaf to say that they do research. And yeah, I know how the game's played. I've been in
Yeah,
Washington long enough. Uh,
yeah, we both have. So, and what I would like to see, maybe I'm a cockeyed optimist. I would like to see the nonprofit profession step up and take responsibility and hold ourselves accountable for how out of control and how big this has gotten. Because
yeah,
I think the groups that do really help people directly, women shelters, as you've mentioned, animal rescue groups who help, little living creatures who can't speak for themselves. One of my favorites is Best Friends Animal Society. They are a nonprofit. They help any animal in need, and that animal can live with them forever. So if you give them money, it goes directly to what they're trying to do. But they probably still have to pay property taxes because they're out in Utah, and I don't know what the state laws are in Utah. In
yeah,
Maryland, where I live, we have what they call non-stock corporations, and that's what our community association is formed as in the state of Maryland. But basically, we need to remember we are a business. We are a unique business. We're a business specialty. And that means, as responsible corporate citizens, we need to be paying our fair share. We need to be looking at how we're doing things. And maybe we have fallen from the true religion, as Renee Belloc says to Indiana Jones in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And we have fallen from the true faith. And maybe this is our wake up call to come back to the true faith and really do what we say we exist for. There's so much focus on corporate attitudes. I think the infusion of corporate mindset into the nonprofit business function, despite the fact that we all know no margin, no mission. But if we start acting like for-profits, how do you think it's going to come out? We're going to start looking like them. We're going to start thinking like them, and we're going to lose our way and lose the real reason that we exist.
Well, yeah, let me just remind folks, though, of the magnitude of what we're looking at. As I mentioned at the outset, the nonprofit world now is about 3.3 to $3.5 trillion worth of income. It's largely completely outside of the tax system. More than half of that is the healthcare sector. Hospitals, nonprofit hospitals are a $1 trillion business that are nonprofit. You add on to those the insurance aspect of those, the HMOs like Kaiser, that's another 500 billion. So now we're talking about $1.5 trillion that are essentially nonprofit. Then you add on the universities, and we're looking at another $300 to $400 billion worth of nonprofit income. And then the credit unions, and the world of what we traditionally think of as charities is shrinking. It's a very, very small part of this overall universe, this economy, this tax-exempt economy. The charitable aspect of that is very, very small. And most people don't realize it. And so we've got to draw some harder lines between these and get away from this notion that these big businesses should somehow be exempt from taxation, because this is what economists call double non-tax income. I get to deduct my charitable contribution to this charity. They don't pay income tax on that. Then they get to invest it in their endowment. They don't pay tax on the investment income on that endowment. I'm a business. I'm ABC News, or I'm ABC Network. I give NCAA a bunch of money to put on March Madness. I get to deduct that as a business expense. They don't pay tax on that. That's completely outside the tax system. We can't have a tax system like that. And especially when we have such fiscal troubles as we do now. You can't have those big holes in the tax system, and we've got to repair those holes. We have to plug those holes so that we have a fair and neutral and level playing field.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a big fan of the flat tax.
Yeah.
That everybody just pay the flat tax for your federal income tax, and then whatever your state and local decides to do is up to them. You also, I know we've been having such a great conversation. We've been going on for a while, but you have 3 steps in your paper that I think are a great starting place for nonprofits to take a hard look at ourselves and how we're doing things, and stop fear mongering and start talking and having those conversations about how could we do things differently. So your first step is raise the threshold for the percentage of charitable contributions a C3 must receive to be considered publicly supported. You've already stated that. I think that's a great starting place. That's a very clear rule. The second step would be to eliminate UBIT and just apply the tax. So you just think no UBIT at all.
Right. Yeah. And we look, the 990 provides a nice guide for how we can move toward this kind of a system, because the 990 requires us nonprofits to line item our gifts and contributions, any gifts that we get from the federal government or grants. And then the rest comes down to program service income, which is virtually everything else that you might get, whether it's TV revenues, royalties, income, investment income, et cetera. And all of that then it is essentially business related income. So that the 990 really can provide us that guidance for moving toward a system in which we can clearly identify charitable income and separate that from business-related income, which is virtually everything else. And that way, it's not that hard to move toward the system I'm talking about. One of the challenges that we do have to, the third aspect of that is how do we treat investment income? And last year, nonprofits earned about $78 billion in investment income. That's currently not taxed. And so we ought to tax that largely at the same rate that you and I would pay when or a business would pay when it would draw income from our 401k. Again, this is all bringing neutrality and fairness to the tax system so that we do have this level playing field.
No, I agree. And I loved it. I laughed out loud when I read your statement that the tax exemption for investment income allowed some large nonprofits to become tax-exempt hedge funds.
Yes.
Because what are they doing with this money? We saw a lot of reserve funds sitting during the pandemic lockdown and not being used. They're sitting on this money. What's happening with this money? This money is supposed to be active in contributing, doing things for society. So that is step 3, audience, is let's look at this investment income again and how we do things. So Scott, this has been wonderful talking with you. I so appreciate you taking the time to come on Radio Free 501c and discuss your paper, you yourself, the author, explaining it to people. I like to ask my guest, what is the one thought you'd like the audience to take away today? And if they'd like to talk with you more about your paper and your ideas and proposals, how can they get in touch with you?
Well, I hope that we've sparked a conversation that's, I think, 100 years overdue. And I hope people approach it with an open mind and that they're willing to question the status quo and try to come to a sort of a different framework for understanding the nonprofit sector. And I hope that I've sparked that conversation. They're welcome to contact me. Well, first go to the Tax Foundation website and pull down that paper and read it. And then if you want to contact me, I'm at Arnold Ventures. So you can at shodge@arnoldventures.org. And I welcome anybody's comments and questions. And I'm more than willing to get into this debate because I think it's important. And again, it's long overdue.
Oh, thank you so much, Scott. I agree with you. And this is such a well-written, thoughtful paper. I strongly encourage everyone in our profession and our community to get a copy and read it. Again, it's called Reining in America's $3.3 trillion Tax-Exempt Economy. I want to thank you, audience, for joining us for this special edition and this important conversation. I want to thank Scott, the author of this important paper, for joining me today. If you have not yet subscribed or followed us on your favorite podcast service, these are the kinds of conversations we bring out into the light. So please take a moment and subscribe or follow us at your convenience. If you'd like to learn more about Rogue Tulips Consulting, check out our website, roguetulips.com. We're going to go rogue for now. On behalf of Scott and myself, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. That's it for this week. I hope you really loved this episode as much as I did. Thanks for listening. Learn more about how our experience and knowledge at Rogue Tulips can give your organization the strategic edge to reach its goals. Check out our website at roguetulips.com. We'd love to talk with you and see how we can work together. Thanks.